what people are interested in from Amazon is how to scale, because Amazon is scaled in a way that even some of the other large companies haven't. I found solving human puzzles was more challenging and satisfying than solving technical puzzles.
That's a good one.
The partnership worked very well. It was easy. We did build it. We did ship it. But most importantly, customers loved it. And then the press loved it. You can almost always apply the analogies from your base education to leadership. I like the fact that you point out that cult and culture is kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? Cult is what we say when we don't agree with the culture. And when we do, we call it a culture.
All right. Welcome everyone to our next episode of the Agile Insights conversation. Today, I'm being joined by Ethan Evans, who is, as far as I know, not an author of a book yet, but he has created some amazing e-learning around how to be a very effective leader within an organization. And contrary to the many interviews that I run with authors of the books behind me, this will be a conversation that I lead with a practitioner. So someone who has been in the trenches, who has done the work and can report from that. Now, Ethan, welcome to the show. I'm so grateful that despite the two of us not knowing each other, you agreed to do this interview with me. Thank you for being here.
Hi, it's really my pleasure. I enjoy talking to people about what I do and sharing my coaching approach. The book will come. It's in progress, but no set date yet.
Yeah, probably we'll run another conversation once the book is out. Now, Ethan,
probably.
As most of the people listening to this conversations don't know you yet, right? Would you mind giving us a brief introduction about who you are, what your personal journey has been, and what you currently do?
Sure. So my name's Ethan, and I started as an engineer and then spent 12 years in startups. So I actually worked all for small companies the first dozen years of my career. Very quickly, I switched to management. The first company I was at had a vacuum in management, and I stepped into that role with no intention of being a professional manager. It was what was needed, and I found I loved it. So I rose to the vice president level pretty quickly in a startup context. So in that context, managing teams of 10 to 30. Then I was recruited by Amazon. And I joined Amazon. My title went downwards. I became a senior manager, but my scope went upwards. And so I spent 15 years at Amazon. The most well-known product I worked on was I was the first engineer working on Prime Video, which almost everyone knows. I spent 15 years at Amazon. I rose to vice president there, leading teams of up to 800. And along the way, I discovered that I really loved helping people grow in their careers, mentoring others. So after 15 years at Amazon, I realized I was in a position to leave Amazon and pursue whatever I wanted. I did, and now I'm semi-retired. I teach, coach, and write, mostly on LinkedIn, with a focus on helping leaders take their careers to the next level and helping everyone find satisfaction in their jobs, because so many people don't like their work or feel frustrated with their work. And I feel like that's a tragedy, to spend a huge part of your life unhappy with a major part of your life. So I try to cure that.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable mission. I don't know to what extent you looked into my background, but I initially studied medicine. So I'm a medical doctor by education. And then I moved into this world of business just out of curiosity, also because I could not agree or decide on which specialty I wanted to do. And then I felt, similar to you falling in love with management, I fell in love with this world of business. But I always had the same feeling that you just described. It's so sad that so many people don't love what they do. And being a medical doctor, I also know that this has incredible health costs, right? And
Yes.
those costs, of course, have then to be taken on by society. But even on an individual level, people getting sick, people burning out, all of that, that's not a nice thing. So I've dedicated my life to making workplaces more enjoyable, more fun, but also more productive. Because if we're productive, it's good for the individual, it's good for the organization, and the organizations can have a longer life and health span, which then again results in a lot of benefits for the individual. So I think we're there. We share some common values, which is great. Now, Ethan, thanks for that introduction. And some of these things I knew. I didn't know that you spent so many years prior to joining Amazon at startups.
Hmm.
And you mentioned that you started out as an engineer. And because there was a vacuum in management, you took over that role and you loved it. What did you love about it? What was it? Because for many engineers, making that transition is difficult as they love
Yeah.
engineering so much.
So I always express it as I found solving human puzzles was more challenging and satisfying than solving technical
That's a good
puzzles.
one.
I love technical puzzles. It's fun to make a piece of code work. Um, but people aren't programmable. You can only influence them. And what made it fascinating is you get a human system working today, and tomorrow the person comes to work and they've had an argument with their significant other or a sick child or who knows what's happened in their life. And the same system that was working yesterday is broken today. And so I found that fascinating. And how do I take these people that aren't always the same every day and lose their motivation or get frustrated or can't talk to each other? And how do I make a really strong team? How do I bring everyone together? And the other thing, of course, is how do you improve the people? How do you show them a path where of course, I have like a goal of I want you to be stronger on my team, but you have to be a part of that goal. You have to want it too. And so I found that whole process just endlessly fascinating. And that's kind of what I loved about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the way that you phrased it, like a technical puzzle versus the human puzzle, and
Yeah.
one being controllable using the circles of control, the other one only being influenceable, which is so
Yes.
true. I never thought about it this way, but it really is so true. And maybe that's also one of the reasons. I mean, I always loved medicine because it was the application of all sciences into one system, the human body.
Hmm.
And when I made the switch to consulting and then later mainly working with organizations on how to redesign, I always come back to the medical analogy, right? Now I have this huge system which is made out of humans, not organs. And it is my job to figure out how I can cure the diseases that this organization has. And it seems that you have found, based on your background, a similar path into the space of management and then coaching leaders to create more enjoyable places to work. Now,
I
go
often
ahead.
think, by the way, that you can almost always apply the analogies from your base education to leadership. So you're taking analogies to the human body and medical system and applying them to organizations. And I did the same, just viewing the organization as an engineering system, not being overly cold or pedantic about it, but you view each person as some sort of component and you view each goal as some sort of desired output. And there's an engineering analogy. All analogies are imperfect, but they allow you to apply all the things you studied to the problem you face.
Absolutely.
Um, so when I coach leaders, I often find myself saying, okay, you're a salesperson. This is how you would use what you know about sales to run an organization, or you're a product person, or you're a lawyer. This is how what you already know gives you a model for what it is you're trying to do.
Yeah. I think that's important, right? Building bridges to the known in order to face the unknown. And that usually makes it easier for people to also then embark on that journey.
Yep.
Now, you spent several years at startups, primarily in
Yes.
management positions, and then you make that shift to Amazon. At what year? Maybe I didn't pay attention. I know you stayed there
No,
for
I didn't
15
give a
years.
year. In 2005 is when I
2000
changed from startups, my last startup, to Amazon.
Okay, so 2005, that was still long before Amazon was the behemoth that they are today, way before that.
Yes.
Now, what did you find when you joined Amazon? What kind of a company was it? Because there's so many stories around that company, around Jeff, around some of the other leaders. I have working backwards behind me many copies. I've spoken to Colin Breyer several times. Now, what did you find as someone joining that company at that point in time?
Yeah. So many things to say there. First, the other author of Working Backwards was one of my early managers. So I worked for Bill Carr, and I appear in that book, although not in a very flattering light. It was a big disaster of a demo that went terribly wrong early in our career. Um, but what I found, I was very worried about joining Amazon because at that time it was only a retailer, and I worried, am I joining the IT department of a bookstore? Like, is that the trade off I'm making? Um, but the startup I was at was not doing very well, and Amazon was offering me a good salary, and they had come out of the .com bust, so they were fairly successful. And so I said, well, let's go see. And it was meant to be a short term move. I was moving from a whole life on the East Coast of the United States to Seattle. And so very far away from family and friends. And I kind of had in mind like 2 to 4 years and I'll move back. What I found was a company that to my eyes was huge, but to the current scope of Amazon was tiny. Amazon at that time was about 14,000 employees. And when I left, it was about 1.4 million. So 100 times larger. So 14,000, though, the biggest company I had ever worked at was a startup that I joined when it was about 140 people, and it grew to be about 1,400. So this was 10 times as big as anything I'd ever seen. And I thought it was enormous. And so it was big, but I was very lucky. I joined the company not knowing what product I would work on. I joined under, like a secret deal where they're like, we need you to work on something, but we can't tell you what it is, but here's a good offer. Will you come? And I accepted blind, and it turned out what I ended up building was Prime Video. So I spent my first 4 years starting what has now become the massive Prime Video empire. And so I really lucked out, to be super honest. I joined a company where Amazon Web Services was being worked on, but wasn't public, where the Amazon Kindle was being worked on, but wasn't public. And of course, where Prime Video was being worked on and wasn't public. And I got to be there through all of those sort of transformative reveals.
Yeah. So, all of those things, it was, you mentioned they were being worked on, but they weren't public, but they also were far away from a sure bet, right?
Oh, for sure.
We saw other things that Amazon worked on and they didn't work out, like the Fire Phone, right? And nobody could have known that either of the things that you mentioned would work out and make it the company that it is today. Now, the scale that you mentioned, you joined when they were 14,000 people, and when you left 1.4 million, so 100x. That's huge, right? To go through that journey. I think very few people in their lives, or maybe in all of humanity, will have had a similar experience in that sense, other than fellow Amazonians and maybe people at Apple or Google or some of these companies. So you join with that team working on Prime Video. At what point in your journey were the leadership principles developed? Because you joined not as a VP, but as a senior manager, if I recall correctly.
Yep, that's right.
But those leadership principles would also be relevant for someone in your position. At what point did they emerge?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the leadership principles existed in a different form when I arrived. When I first got there were 3 lists, not one. So there was like a list of core values and a list of leadership principles and a third list. And shortly after I got there, they became version 2, where they said 3 lists is dumb. Let's call them all leadership principles and merge them. They then went through later 2 more iterations. Today, I would call what they are as generation 4 in my mind. So I arrived at generation one. I went to generation four, and during that time, I actually helped write one of the leadership principles. So I'm very proud of the fact 6 words. It's not a huge contribution, but 6 words in the ownership leadership principle are directly from me, which is kind of a fun because it's still influencing the 1.5 million people at Amazon. So, it might be the highest leverage 6 words of my life.
The best LinkedIn post of your life, right? Highest leverage.
Right.
But I think it's impacting more than the 1.5 million people at Amazon today, because so many other organizations look at those leadership principles, take inspiration from them, discuss them. I mean, I use them in all of my leadership courses that I teach, not as something to copy and paste, but as something that provides clarity to every leader of what is expected. But then also, and I think this is the wonderful work that Colin and Bill have done, is to demonstrate what Amazon does in terms of structures, etc., to ensure that people follow or live these leadership principles on a daily basis. And I would be interested in not hearing from those 2 authors, but from someone who was there from generation one to generation four. How did you experience the things that were done within the company to ensure that leaders like you were living those leadership principles and keeping them alive?
Yeah. So Amazon has a really great system. All companies, if you dig deep enough, have a poster somewhere that says what they believe. They've got some slogans. The difference is Amazon made them real, and they really had 3 ways to do that, I think. The first way is it was part of how you interviewed. So when you interviewed somebody, everyone was assigned 1 or 2 leadership principles to cover. So when you go to an interview, maybe if you and I are both interviewing the same person, you'll be assigned to assess their bias for action and their ownership, and I will be assigned to assess their invent and simplify and think big, and so on. So it's a part of the hiring conversation, both for the interviewers and for the candidate. Then it's a part of the evaluation conversation. So in the annual review, you get feedback, and that feedback is categorized along the lines of the leadership principles. So how am I doing at think big? How am I doing at be right a lot? Finally, it's part of the promotion conversation. So every promotion document will discuss, where is this individual strong? Where do they still have opportunities to grow? And it will be categorized. So this is what Amazon calls using a mechanism, that the only way to get large scale adoption of something is to create infrastructure and tooling and a systematic approach that ensures that it's used. And so by baking the leadership principles into these 3 processes, which is hiring, evaluation, and promotion, it ensured that they were widely used. Now, the end result, and I'll speak a little bit to engineers here, is that these leadership principles became used like code snippets or like shorthand that you would get from a design pattern, which means I could say, well, I'm worried about our bias for action here. And that would convey an entire paragraph or several paragraphs of thought, because the person I'm speaking to says, oh, bias for action, I know what that means here. Are we showing enough of it? Or I could have a conversation of, I need you to own this project. And own, of course, is an English word, but at Amazon, it's a loaded word with this big context of ownership. And if someone says, okay, yes, I own it, you've had a whole conversation without having to repeat it. And it sped things up because of that shared understanding. Now, outside critics would say that's almost a cult, right? Where because everyone's working to these same principles, it reduces independent thought because you're speaking in this sort of inside shorthand. I don't agree with that perspective, but I can see it where they feel that the leadership principles are so deeply rooted that they're creating people that only obey the principles that don't really think outside the principles. And we do talk about how the principles can be abused. They can either be overly simplified or they can be weaponized. So when you weaponize a principle, you're essentially using it as a club. And so a classic example there is we have the principle earn trust, which says if I'm working with you and you're a peer leader, I'm supposed to work in such a way that I earn your trust, that I build a relationship with you, that I'm reliable. Well, if you want to try and weaponize that and I'm not doing, I'm disagreeing with you, or I'm saying I don't have time for something because of good reasons, you can weaponize and say, well, you're not earning my trust right now. And you can try and use it as like a bludgeon of you're supposed to do this thing and you're not, and I'm going to hit you with it. And so we had to train people to resist that and understand like what's an appropriate use and what isn't. Second, sometimes the leadership principles can be used in an overly simplified way. They were meant to be applied thoughtfully. But if you take the leadership principle of frugality as an example, so frugality says don't waste money, use money only in a way that helps the customer. We used to joke that people would do something we called frupidity, which is a mashup of frugal and stupid. And obviously the easiest way to appear frugal is say no to every expense. Can I go on this business trip? No. Can we buy this piece of software? No. Can I go to this training? No. Now I look frugal because I'm not spending anything, but in fact, I'm foolishly not investing. And so there are, no system is perfect. The leadership principles are incredibly powerful, but just because they're well tested doesn't mean you can turn your brain off to use them. You still have to think.
Yeah. No, I think, you provided just a lot of insights that despite looking at this company for more than a decade, reading everything that's out there about it, talking to other Amazonians, you provided a few insights that I hadn't heard before. And I love that. Thank you for that. But at the very beginning of what you just mentioned, you brought up the term cult, right? And when I share the leadership principles at Amazon or one of the shareholder letters in one of my agile leadership courses, and I also share Tesla's anti-handbook. I'm not sure if you have come across that. Probably you have. If not, it's a wonderful thing to read. People always bring up, oh, both of these companies appear to be a cult. And I go and say, yes, but that's a culture, right? That's a culture. You're very strong in that culture. And I've had the chance to work with some organizations that are older than 100 years old. One of them is over 400 years old. What do they have is a strong culture. And it doesn't mean that you try to go into a certain direction and you don't want any diversity of thought, etc. But you still want consistency with regards to certain principles. And I think the 14, now 16 leadership principles lay that out really well. What is expected of a leader? And yes, I think they can be overly simplified. They can be weaponized, as you pointed out very clearly. But it's a great thing to have in order to create a strong culture within an organization. How do you look at that, Ethan?
Yeah, well, they're absolutely the core of the culture. And I like the fact that you point out that like cult and culture is kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? Cult is what we say when we don't agree with the culture. And when we do, we call it a culture. I guess the thing that was great about this and it made it powerful for an organization is people who didn't like the leadership principles left. And I'm not saying they should have, that it was great that they left, but it resulted in the remaining people being able to work together very efficiently with tremendous shared understanding. And so it definitely sped up the pace of work at the company. It's also true, you obviously have a great shelf of books back there. You've probably read Built to Last.
Yes.
And one of the things in Built to Last, which is much more of a like last generation management classic, is it pointed out how most companies that survive for the long term have a very strong culture, and that culture doesn't need to be one that everyone else agrees with. They use the example of the tobacco company RJR Nabisco, and RJ Reynolds is the tobacco side. They've kind of hidden their name on purpose because big tobacco is like a shunned industry. But within that industry, they talk about how that company made clear to their employees that we are a pro-smoking company. Like, our business is smoking. And if you don't want to be a smoker or at least support smoking, you should leave. Now, I don't like smoking, and I don't believe that was a good culture. But the book takes you through how, by getting everyone that did stay on one page, they then created a company that was successfully pro-smoking. Now, this shows that culture can, maybe if you think smoking is evil, can be used for good or evil. But I thought it was a great example of how culture could allow a company to hold together over the long term, even in an adverse environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's this famous quote from Patrick Lencioni, or I had the pleasure to work with him and his team at some point. And he said, there's actually two things you have to do as a leader. You need to get everyone in the same boat. That's one.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that they all row in the same direction, and ideally the same rhythm. And what you just mentioned around the RGR example is all around alignment, right? A culture can help us create the necessary alignment so that, and the examples you provided earlier, like earn trust or own this thing, right? It makes communication more efficient because we are aligned in terms of how we interpret certain words. And then, of course, you can also create alignment around the strategy of an organization, which then trickles down into day-to-day decision making and provides the foundation for more and more of these decisions being decentralized, which then Amazon refers to type 2 and the other ones type 1 decisions, if I'm informed correctly, right? But this is the foundation. If you don't have that, you have to constantly debate and discuss everything that you want teams to work on. And that, of course, is then not that efficient. And if your competitor is aligned, they just pace beside you, right?
Yeah. So in terms of speed, one of the things Amazon says that gets it accused of being a cult a lot is, one of the leadership principles is have backbone, disagree, and commit.
Yeah.
And what this says is, if you disagree with someone or if you have a different idea, your first responsibility is to stand up and raise that disagreement. And in fact, argue for it, fight for it, stick to it. But once a sufficiently high-level leader, and we can always debate what that is, makes a decision, then whether you agree or not, get behind it and try to make it successful. And this part is where the cult accusation comes in, because employees are asked, if you don't agree with something, but a decision is made, get on board. So like a very current example of that is return to office. Many employees at Amazon enjoyed working remotely and in fact have fought quite hard to work remotely. But the CEO has made a decision and said, thank you for your input. We've considered it. We're now going to work from the office. And it's very clear, either come into the office or leave. And that is the message. And so what that results in is, what definitely won't work is to have a work from the office message that's inconsistently enforced and that everybody's kind of half adhering to. That's a complete mess. So even though I happen to be on the side that says, I would be, if I were still working there, I would object to that. I would say, I think they've gone too far in the direction of return to office. But I completely understand that having made that decision, they're now saying we're all going to do this together. Because what's definitely not going to work is to have an ad hoc, hypocritical, some people obey, some people don't. That undermines the whole leadership team.
Absolutely.
So I completely understand where they're going.
Yeah. But you know, it's interesting. And I like the example that you brought up. When I read this and when I got familiar with disagree and commit, I always thought to myself, of course, why wouldn't it be any different? Why would it be any different? And then I explored this and I remember that, I mean, all my life I've played team sports, football, or in the American term,
Yeah,
soccer, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
later basketball. And if the coach calls a play, that's what you do. You can disagree with it and discuss during the huddle, but once the coach calls the play or says the formation that you're going to spend the 90 minutes football, that's what you do. You can't. And if you don't like that coach or if you don't like that team, you leave the team, right? And I find it so hard that in many organizations, they or many people don't understand it. And when I meet those people, when I talk to them, I realize that many of them never played team sports in their lives.
Mm.
And then okay, so they didn't have the experience that I have in that particular case. So it is something that they need a bit of support in terms of learning. Have you made similar experiences, Ethan?
Yeah, so I have, and I play team sports too. I play ice hockey. Um, but I think where I was going is that a lot of companies actually don't strongly have this concept. And you see that the CEO or some vice president or whoever makes a decision, but under them, teams continue to undermine each other. And they're like, well, that's what they're doing, but we're going to do what we want. And it's just very hard. Look, I love freedom. Okay. America is a country that's overly in love with the idea of personal freedom. And I'm actually one of those people emotionally that's like, oh, don't tell me what to do. I'm free, blah, blah, blah. But at work, if we all exercise that, it's just chaos. It's what we call herding cats or cats in a bag. It's not going to work because it is a team. And I think a huge, again, people can pick on Amazon and say, oh, it's a cult. But that cult is damned effective at getting things done. Now, sometimes that means we all drive off the cliff together. I was part of the Fire Phone team. At that time, I had moved on from Prime Video and I was working on our app store. And so I was responsible for putting the app store on the phone. And it's really interesting. This is a story you'll probably like. I raised my disagreement with the Fire Phone several times, including at a lunch. My skip level boss was Andy Jassy, who at that time, he's now CEO, but he was CEO of Amazon Web Services at that time. And I was working on the Fire Phone, and my team was telling me how bad of a product it was. I went to my boss, a man named Mike George, and I said, hey, I don't think this is a very good product. Like, what do we do? I don't think it's very good. And he said, I don't think it's too good either, but we're going to trust Jeff. Jeff thinks it's good. And I said, oh, okay, trust Jeff. So then I was invited to lunch with Andy Jassy, who was Jeff's direct and obviously his successor. And even then we could kind of see like who was going to be the successor. So I'm like, okay, I've got the number 2 guy. And I said, Andy, this thing doesn't seem to be that good. I don't see that it's going to work that well. What do we do? And Andy said, it doesn't seem that good to me either, but we're going to trust Jeff. And, so this is where disagree and commit failed, in that the decision that was made turned out to be wrong. But what didn't fail is the thing got built and launched. Now, so if everyone had if I'd have been like, well, I disagree, I'm not going to put any more effort into it, then I would have crippled the phone and it would have had no chance. So by all of us doing what we thought was right in terms of following along with the direction, the phone did ship. If I had just disagreed and been like, well, I'm going to take my team and like deprioritize this, then it would have had no chance, because it would have had like, say, a crappy app store, because I would have not put enough effort into it. So that's a case of both sides of the story. the key, and you understand this in a team sports sense, is you may get beaten. But if your team members don't even execute the play, they don't hold the formation, if we talk about soccer, and people are like, well, I'm a midfielder, but I'm moving up to striker on my own initiative, and then it's a disaster. And as opposed to it being, well, we lost 1-0, that's sad. It's like, wow, you got blown out 7-0. How did that happen? Well, everybody decided their own play. And that's a disaster.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the story of Fire Phone as a 1-0 loss.
As a 1-0 loss, and as something, and I like that you emphasized it, you still had the success in shipping, right? Building the product,
we got the product done,
getting everything together. And if I'm informed correctly, many people that worked on the Fire Phone later worked on the Echo devices, right? And having built the ability and the relationships and the teamwork to get something of that scale out of the door, right? That's also part of the disagree and commit to the Fire Phone that then enables so many other things. So in total, I don't believe there's anything out there that can help us to create sure successes. Why? Because these successes depend on so many other things, including the customer, right? Including the overall market. But having the ability to continuously ship something, get people aligned on something, it's really powerful. Now, being mindful of our time, Ethan, I don't want to talk all the time about Amazon. It's so fascinating, but you left Amazon after 15 years.
I did.
You went through this incredible journey, 100x the size of the organization. You also went through the ranks. You were a vice president in the end. 800 people reporting basically into your organization or part of the organization. And then you semi-retire, as you mentioned at the beginning, but decide to work with organizations and probably mostly individual leaders. That's an assumption that I'm making, in order to help them take their careers to the next level and build great places. I wanted to ask you about the why, but you mentioned that why earlier on. That's your fundamental belief. That's the passion that you have. Now, what I would be interested in, what elements of the Amazon, let's call it operating system, have you taken to other organizations, to other leaders, and what have been the effects? You don't have to name the companies or the people, right? I understand confidentiality, etc. But I would just be interested in a few more stories of how these principles were applied at other places.
Yeah, it's a great question. So naturally, many of the people I coach or that I teach are at the other high-tech companies. So they're going to be at the so-called FANG or manga collection of other high-tech companies, but not all of them. I talk to people all over the world in all kinds of companies. And I think from bringing Amazon culture, what people are interested in from Amazon is how to scale, because Amazon is scaled in a way that even some of the other large companies haven't. If you take the example of me that you cited, my first team was 6 people. When I was hired for the first year, I managed 6 people, which was a big step down. I had been managing teams of 20 to 30, and now I'm essentially a first line manager with 6 direct reports. But over time, I ended up with 800 people, which is was way out of my league. And I had to learn all these new skills. I think Amazon, I bring the leadership principles to other people, but a lot of what I bring is the mental model. How do you always think about scale? How do you always start with the customer? How do you do, as Bill Carr and Colin Breyer's book says, how do you work backwards to come up with the right ideas? And how do you drive for implementation? If there was one, even though I contributed to the ownership leadership principle, the one I probably applied the most was bias for action. Mm-hmm. I took a lot of gambles at Amazon, and I had the thing is, those risk-taking, they were calculated. And sometimes when you make a calculation, you may say, well, this is 80% likely to work out. You may be right that it's 80% likely. Still, sometimes you end up in the 20%. And so you're left with a problem or even a disaster where you're 20%, you have to accept that. But Jeff taught speed matters in business. And so what I help others see is they're probably better moving quickly and being right 80% of the time than trying to move conservatively and be right all the time. And this is not how we're taught. If you think about school, it's get perfect marks. That's the goal, right? Always get 90, 95, 98% as your marks or A's, whatever system you're in. Amazon would say, maybe get B's really quickly. Maybe the right thing is get through 4 years of college with a B average in 2 years. And that will actually get you further faster. And I think bringing that idea of it's okay to take risk and be wrong, because a lot of people are very afraid of risk. And frankly, a lot of managers punish failure. And so how are you going to work through that? How are you going to deal with having a manager that can't see that moving quickly and being 80% right is a better idea?
So I like to double down on this element of speed matters, because most organizations that I get to work with, when they bring us in and I ask them, why are we here? Like, why do you need our support? They're like, we want to be faster. And it's not about we want to type faster, because you can take a typing course, right? We want to get products out faster, shorten our time to markets, etc. And there's so many things you can do. And of course, in addition, they also want to get the right product out faster, which is very important. So not only drive pace, but also the effectiveness of what you do. Now, you mentioned already a few things about the speed, or that drive speed. One is being okay with 80% instead of aiming for the 100%. And we all understand the 80-20 Pareto principle, etc. And I think it applies in so many levels in the business world and in other places. One of the things that I have come across, and this is a hypothesis that I have, and I want to challenge it with you, is that the speed of decision-making fundamentally drives the speed of an organization's ability to create value for customers. And yes, the willingness to fail in decision-making plays a role here, but I believe also the decentralization, managers being willing to let go so that their teams and individuals within those teams can take decisions as they're closer to the customer faster and in many cases better. What has been your experience around this? Would you back this up? Would you say, no, you're going down the wrong path? I'm curious. I'm asking with a very open mind.
So I would strongly agree with it. And I think at Amazon, I can cite a couple of clear examples. Early in my career, when I was working on what became Prime Video, we were approached with a partnership with TiVo, the DVR company. And TiVo said, we'd like to put your new video service on our device. Would you be willing? So we had a meeting internally, and my vice president was there, but our senior vice president was there. And our senior vice president said, I would not do this partnership. I would not pursue this partnership. It's not that it's a bad partnership, but I think it's a distraction. Like, we should focus on our own product. And if you do this partnership, maybe it will work and maybe it won't, but you'll be entangled with this other company. Well, I had done the work to realize it wasn't going to take a lot of effort to do this partnership, and my beliefs differed. So I said these very key words, and they're kind of words that you wonder about. They just came out of my mouth spontaneously. And I said, well, you've told me I should take more ownership of the product, and I believe in this. And so unless you order me not to, I'm going to do this partnership. And he said, it's your decision. And that's the key, is he said, I wouldn't do it, but it is your decision. Now, as it happened, the partnership worked very well. It was easy. We did build it. We did ship it. But most importantly, customers loved it. And then the press loved it. And what that did is it made all the smart TV manufacturers aware. And they came beating a path to our door saying, oh, we're Sony. Would you put your service on our smart TV? And we're Samsung. So bringing this full circle, I was a senior manager. I had talked all the way up to my senior vice president and said, I'm going to do this. And I later got to see my promotion document to director. And the key line in it said, well, without Ethan, we wouldn't have had TiVo. Like that was basically, they said, like, this guy took this decision and was right. And that's our sign that he's a director level leader. So that's one example of taking that risk. Now, it could have gone wrong. And I also tell stories about decisions I made that went wrong. But we moved quickly. We got it done. We saw benefits. And I think there are many such examples of leaders, including Jeff. I was part of another meeting where a different vice president wanted to purchase a company, a pretty big decision. Now, it wasn't a big company. It wasn't a lot of money. And Jeff said, I don't understand this. I don't think it's good strategy. I'm really not sure about entering this segment, but you seem very sure. And the leader said, yes, I will make this work. And I remember Jeff said, well, I think this leader's name was Greg. And he said, I think we just saw Greg lay his badge down. Like, I'm going to bet my employment on the company on this decision. And he said, I respect that. Like, you want to place that bet. You understand the stakes. I will buy this company with my money as Jeff Bezos. And you understand that if you don't make it work, that may mean the end of your future here. Maybe we won't fire you, but you're never going to get that kind of trust again. And the leader said, okay, I'm on board. Now, we can debate, should the stakes be that high and should there be that implied threat? I don't necessarily think that threat is wrong. It encourages you to really think, well, how committed am I? Like, I love the movie Hunt for Red October, and in it, Sean Connery has that, fake Russian voice where he says, well, when Cortez reached the New World, he burned his ships, and as a result, his men were well motivated. That's what happened there, right? Is that leader understood that he was burning his ships. And by buying this company, it was succeed or pay the price. As a result, he was well motivated.
Yeah. And I think coming back to disagree and commit that you mentioned earlier, if you disagree with someone, but you see how committed someone is, it's much easier for you to be committed with them.
And I think that's key. Once I made that decision to ship with TiVo, everyone above helped me. It wasn't like every 2 weeks, they're like, so Ethan, how's your bad decision on TiVo going?
Yeah.
Right? There wasn't this undermining. And the same thing, the acquisition of that company didn't go that well. But it's not like the people above that VP were like, oh, you are in trouble. They weren't like lurking there to pounce. And instead they're like, hey, we all agreed. And that included Jeff agreeing to buy. And so at that point, Jeff was on board as a cheerleader. And that worked.
So, Ethan, I think that's a very nice closing for our today's session. I hope it's not the last time that I speak to you. At the latest, when your book comes out, I'll come knocking again. But what I take away, it's especially from the last piece, when I asked you, like, what do you transfer to other organizations? It is the mental models, right? It is the understanding of the scale, of the importance of customers, the bias. So many of the principles are also like mental models, like bias for action, speed matters. And I believe this is something where so many organizations can learn, not only from Amazon, but the reason I point to Amazon is, yes, I'm talking to you, but it's also a very well-documented company, both with their leadership principles being out there, but also with the book written by Bill and Colin. It helps organizations deeply understand what this organization is all about. And then there are people like you who bring in their experience as coaches to other leaders, to other organizations, to implement a lot of those things. So I want to use this opportunity to thank you again. I will recommend everyone to follow you on LinkedIn because you post so much valuable stuff out there. And there's very little, actually zero self-promotion. You always provide value to people, the customer obsession from your Amazonian times. And yeah, I hope I'll see you again at some point. Thank you so
Well,
much.
I have really enjoyed this conversation. I would be happy to return when there's more you want to discuss, because it's fun to talk with someone who has so many insights from the other parts of the industry and yet is very familiar with Amazon. You've not only talked to me, but other leaders there. It makes it easy to have a deep conversation. And you're right. I've taken on as my life mission to really help people with their careers. It is true, I sell some classes and things, but I try to do as much as I can to help the broad set of people, because I think that's missing. And the one good thing about not working for anybody else is I am free to share my candid opinion. For example, I disagree with Amazon's return to office approach based on what I know. Now, I'm not inside the company to know what Andy knows. So I have to leave open that maybe he knows something and has better reasoning than I do because he has better information. But I'm able to at least be transparent and hold a no agenda discussion. Yes. And I think that's what a lot of people really value, is that I can talk without needing to worry about my reputation. I often talk about the problems, a totally different topic, but I would like to talk about the problems of male dominated leadership, right? I'm a white man with gray hair. I fit completely the stereotype of, some of the problems in leadership, but I can talk about that because, I don't have to worry about what is HR going to say? I gave an interview about being a gray haired male leader. There's no one second guessing me except me.
Yeah, that's the beauty of freedom. Coming back to that point that you made, everyone in America wants to have this individual freedom. It's also beyond America. I also enjoy the freedom that I have, but I know you have to run to your next meeting, Ethan.
I do.
Thank you so much. And I'll come back knocking on your door.
I look forward to it. This has really been a lot of fun. Thank you.